parade.
Today's scripture reading will be from Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 6. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods, who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are our gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and participated in fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up and indulged in revelry.
So we're living in a season of strikes and shutdowns where you're thinking about writers or actors or auto workers or the government itself. And anytime we're dealing with these things, we kind of watch them. I've watched them all from the side and seeing what they're fighting about, trying to understand who's going to come out ahead in this thing, who's going to win, who's going to lose. But of course, I think usually when these things happen, the trick is, if they're not careful, everybody loses in it, because the trick is, the reason why these things are so vital is the parties that are in dispute need each other. They need some kind of vital working relationship, and the strikes and the shutdowns have just exposed some kind of fracture. There's something going on. And when they succeed, when they get resolved, I think the writers have resolved theirs this week, it comes out of some kind of negotiation. And a lot of times the unsung hero in these challenges is really somebody who has the role of the mediator. Sometimes it's an official role, sometimes it's an unofficial role. But it's the role of the mediator that sometimes they're getting the parties to see, okay, here's how you're going to split the baby, here's how you're going to compromise, and both walk out equally unhappy and kind of live with it. But every now and then, it's the mediator has that real talent to let people see some kind of new possibility. And where this broken relationship, where the workers are at odds with their employers, and many of these examples, that they can see some kind of new way forward, that the company can see, hey, here's how we can survive and thrive and make the money we need to make, and then here's how the employees can say, yeah, and here's how we can function well and be happy with our particular role in it. But that role of the mediator, I've spent years as a litigator and have to have mediators come in for various cases that I would have, and a lot of them was pro forma, but every now and then you saw somebody that really had a gift for seeing both sides and letting them forge some kind of new possibility. It was a season where I learned to appreciate the beauty and the power of really an effective mediator and what they can bring into a broken relationship. Well, Exodus 32 in its own way is a story about mediation. It's a story about the need for a mediator. It's a famous story, well-known piece of Exodus. But what it's doing, as we look at Exodus 32, you're seeing this central failure on the part of Israel to be the people that God's been calling them to be. And as you see this failure unfold, they need a better path. The Exodus 32 is not the end of the story of Israel, as it could have been, but it's really kind of the midpoint of the beginning of another journey. And that new journey happens really because of the mediator that God raises up for them to lead them. So much as I want us to think about the failure of Israel and the failure of the people, I want us to show how that leads us to God really teaching us about the work of the mediator and the mediator that we ultimately need in our own lives. We're going to be in Exodus 32. I encourage you to open it as I want to work through the entire chapter. But the story begins with the failure of the people. And it's an interesting thing to think about, why is this story here in this place? Remember where we've been. We've spent 7 weeks or so dealing with the instructions for the building of the tabernacle. A lot of details about buildings and how big they are and the size and the fabric they're using, the materials they're using, all this kind of stuff on the instructions about the tabernacle. And then, after a few chapters here where we talk about this calf, where we're going to go for the rest of it is building that tabernacle. So sandwiched in between the instructions on how to build the tabernacle and the story of them actually building their tabernacle, we get this story of the people's building of a golden calf and this kind of false worship. Why is it there right in the middle? Well, of course, one of the reasons, because that's the timing of when it unfolded. But that placement here is critical. Because what we're really thinking about is not only just how we're going to worship, but who we're going to worship. Exodus 32 is a presentation of an alternative path that Israel seeks than the path that God is laying out for him. Moses has been up on the mountain for 40 days, almost 6 weeks, getting very detailed instructions on how God wants to be worshiped. He's giving them very detailed instructions. Here's the building you're going to build. Here's how it's going to be built. Here's how you're going to worship me at the building. And in the midst of that, the people are down below looking for something else. So where does that failure lead them? And it really is, what I want us to think about is how the failure expresses itself in a kind of false worship. What 32 is about the people finding a way to do worship poorly and worship the wrong things in the wrong ways. It's false worship. False worship here is first, it's born out of a kind of false wisdom. Where does this all begin? It begins with the way they saw it, of the delay of Moses. And the people saw that Moses delayed. It's been 40 days, not a short amount of time, but it's not as if they don't have evidence in front of them. Remember, Moses ascended into the clouds. They're there at Mount Sinai, the place where they've seen all this wonder and signs, and they see those clouds every single day. But from the people's mindset, Moses is delaying. And so the foundation of this false worship is that the people, Israel, is inserting their own timetable instead of God following God's timetable. Chapter 24, God says, this is the way it's going to be. You're going to come up here. I'm going to take this for you. And the people say, well, I'll deal with that for a while. But then as time goes on, they say, well, I think there's a better way. And I've got a timetable, and God is not keeping my time. Have you ever struggled with that? Have you ever struggled with your own sense of the timetable? This is the way it's supposed to be. This is the way my life is supposed to run. This is the way I want this problem fixed, and I want it fixed on this timetable instead of what we get instead. So we have a temptation to live on our own senses, our own sense of logic. This is how it makes sense. This is how the story is supposed to unfold. And the alternative is to live on God's word and ultimately to live on faith. And I think it's an important thing to see as you see this story of the golden calf unfold, that what Israel is choosing is a path of a false worship that seeks to live on their own senses and their own timetable rather than living on faith. So the false worship is born out of a false wisdom. I know better than God. I can do this my way. The second thing it does is that this false worship seeks answers in the wrong places. What do? They turn to Aaron and they say, well, make us gods. And so what they're really wanting there, and you see it in the fact that it's a calf that's built. Why are they building a calf of all things? Well, the calf, the bull, was all a function of Egyptian worship. And as they say, make us gods, what they're really crying out for is their heart. They're revealing is that their hearts are still in Egypt. They see Egypt as the answer to their desire for God. They're giving an Egyptian answer to a divine problem. There was a prayer that Beth showed me this week that is in a confessional book she was looking at, and one of the things in the prayer, it says that I asked for Egypt, and you gave me a wilderness. It's a fascinating line. Because really what's behind that is, I really need you, God, but what I'm asking for is not for you, I'm asking for Egypt. I'm asking for something that I really shouldn't be asking for, and what God gives them instead is that He gave me a wilderness. which is God is not going to, he's going to serve them well by not giving them that Egypt that they're longing for, and instead he's going to put them in a wilderness where he's going to reveal himself in his own time, in his own way. What we see in the struggle here for Israel is that deep hold that the world has on them. They've grown up in Egypt, they've been there for centuries. This false way of worshiping, the false values of the Egyptian world have just got settled into who they are. It's deep within their DNA, and it's not something that just gets uprooted quickly. Even with all of these miracles that are unfolding, all these remarkable things that are happening, and you say, man, they've had a story. They've had constant witness of the power of God and the might of Yahweh and all of his desire to deliver and his power to deliver. But that testimony, time and time again, is still contending with that deep sense of the Egypt that is in their bones. And so they're asking for it. They're asking for Egypt. They're looking back to Egypt to get them to the promised land. And if you think about it that way, that shows you the great struggle. The geography just doesn't work. They're asking to go back west when they need to head north. It's not going to get them there. But false worship seeks answers in the wrong places. So make us gods who will go before us. Give us something like the God that we want, but give us something that's physical and right in front of us. Because, he said in verse 1, we don't know what's become of him. That Moses has been gone, we just don't know what's there. So this false worship leads them to seek then a shallow satisfaction of deep needs. We'll talk about Aaron and what he does, his complicity in all this, but he fashions them this golden calf, and then he looks at him in verse 4 and he says, hey, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Well, who brought him up out of the land of Egypt? Well, God did. Yahweh did. And one of the things that Aaron does is he tries to take this desire for this Egyptian idol and he tries to steer it, if you will, towards God. Well, here's a representation not of the Egyptian gods, but of the real God, the one who's brought you up out of Egypt. He's trying to direct them. And so what do they do in response? Well, he built an altar for him, and he said, hey, you have a feast to the Lord. So he's trying to direct them. And they rose up, and they offer burnt offerings and peace offerings. This is verse 6. And they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, where have we seen those ideas before? There's burnt offerings and peace offerings. Well, we just spent 7 chapters getting all these instructions on all these offerings that they're supposed to be offering. So these are echoes of the real worship that they're meant to offer. And so they're eating and drinking. Well, what did they do when they were at the mountain? They ate and drank. The elders went up and they ate and drank in the presence of Yahweh. So this idea of fellowshipping, that's a fellowship meal that they're having in the presence of God. These are echoes of what they're really meant for. But what they're doing is they're taking all of these forms of the worship of Yahweh and they're fundamentally turning it into the worship of this false idol, and I think ultimately really turning it into a worship of self. And really where it results in is that the last word of verse 6, they rose up to play. There's something going on. And later on, Moses comes down the mountain, he sees them, they're singing and drinking and all sorts of revelry. Some actually think there's some kind of sexual overtone in that. And I think that's probably not here, but it actually happens later in some of their false worship, that it goes into this. But they wind up turning this into something that is false, but they're seeking a satisfaction, this kind of licentious play that they're satisfying personal cravings instead of the relationship that they really need. They're seeking a shallow satisfaction of a deep need. They have something real fundamental they need, which is the worship of Yahweh, a life of vital relationship with the God of this world. And they're going to play with it instead. They get something else. And it's settling. They're settling too lightly for less than what they need. And then that really leads to the fourth idea I want you to see about their failure, which is that false worship then worsens the problem that it tries to solve. They're in the wilderness. They're at the mountain. They don't know what's going on. They haven't seen Moses in a while. They doubt. They can't figure out how to live on faith. They want to be certain that God is in their presence And so they build this false idol that Aaron steers into this kind of representation of God. And in this idolatry, the result fundamentally is separation from God. The result is that they are separated more further from the one who they're trying to actually reach in this false worship. They're worse off than when they started. Where you see that most vividly represented in the chapter is as Moses comes down the mountain, he takes the tablets and he will shatter them in verse 19. Throws the tablets out of his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. These two tablets that are engraved, the finger of God, the writing that are showing this covenant. These two tablets that show God and Israel in relationship with one another, shatters it, representing the idea that the people have broken their covenant with God. So this false worship worsens the problem that it tries to solve and leads the people more despondent, more separated, more isolated. So that's the failure of the people, but it's driven by, really animated by the failure of a leader. And in this case, it's a failure of the high priest. Now remember, again, where we've just been. We spent 7 chapters talking about not only just the tabernacle, but also about the priesthood that's going to be leading that tabernacle, that are going to be administering in the tabernacle. And we've talked about all about the garments that they're wearing, and especially the garments of the high priest, which is the robe that Aaron is supposed to be wearing. This high priest is going to be representing the people to God, that's going to be standing in the gap, that's going to be the one person that could go into the most holy place, to go before the presence, to the throne room of God. All of this high sense of the calling of the priesthood, and especially the high priest. We've had all these instructions about how they're going to be ordained and set apart generation after generation. And so we have this glimpse of this guy who's going to be high priest in his first big moment. And what does he do? He fails miserably in that first test. He fails as a leader. And what he offers is a kind of false leadership. Where does Aaron fail in this story? Well, it's a false leadership. What he does first is that a false leader and false leadership follows the people in fear instead of leading them. What do? He said, the people gathered themselves in verse 1 together to Aaron. And there's a sense of ominous threat there. It's like they're surrounding him, threatening him. And so what does Aaron do? He says, take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. There's this sense of threat. And some people read that verse 2 as if what he's doing there is he's kind of got a little bit of a delay action. It's like, well, go gather up all the jewelry you got. And maybe they move a little faster than he hoped. And then they come back to him and said, yeah, we've got it. And then he's stuck. But what he's doing in all of this is living in fear. He says it in verse 22 when Moses is asking about what happened. He said, well, you know the people, that they're set on evil. They said to me, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. So I said to them, let any who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire. And so you see him, first piece of that is he's responding out of fear. He's seeking to live and lead out of fear instead of faith. And that's the burden of the high priest here, is to lead the people by exercising faith, by demonstrating faith. And I think that's a challenge for any person in any kind of leadership position in the church, anybody that's leading a ministry in any way, shape, or form, that we cannot live and operate out of fear. We have to live and operate out of faith, that we can be always faced with uncertainty. I mean, we're entering a season right now. We're in a budget season right now. Budgets are stressful, right? And we always think, how are we going to make ends meet? How are we going to make where's that money going to come from? We're always living on faith. The temptation is to live out of fear, and that will lead you down a dark path. False leadership follows the people in fear instead of leading them. Aaron is reacting out of fear to the threat of the people. And that leads him, second, to a bad kind of compromise. False leadership seeks to compromise with evil rather than lead with integrity. Now, I say that carefully because compromise can be a really huge asset to a leader. Well, we probably need a whole new generation of people in Washington that have learned the art of compromise, because it'd be sure nice if people would say, let's figure out how we can get along and try to live together. It could be a huge asset. Compromise can be an extraordinary thing, but what you can't do is compromise with evil, which is what Aaron's trying to do. Because this is not a thing where you say, well, we can, reasonable minds can disagree, and we can have different opinions about things. What Aaron can see, what's right in front of him, when they're asking for them to make them gods, he has the 10 Commandments. The people have had the 10 Commandments. The people have already bound themselves to the 10 Commandments. They've said, yep, we're going to do that. They've already been bound in covenant to these 10 Commandments. And Aaron can look at that and say, yeah, you're making a representation of God. You're building idols. I got 2 commandments you're violating right there. You're done. So it's an evil thing that they're asking to do. And what does he do? He has them gather the gold to delay. He fashions this. And think about that image there. He said he received the gold, fashioned it with a graving tool, and made a golden calf. What did we just read about a few chapters ago? We read about God raising up craftsmen with these Renaissance man skill, surrounded by other craftsmen, all endowed with the Spirit of God to build things and to craft these things that God has purposed. God has set them apart, and God is going to raise up people that are going to craft the things that he wants, the furnishings that he wants, the worship so that he can have the worship that he wants. And what do you see this high priest doing here? But taking and crafting things and fashioning things that are violating the covenant of God, that are leading the people astray by participating in this. You see Aaron fashioning something in his own strength and in his own wisdom as a matter of expediency. I just got to make peace with these people. We just got to function. I'm just going to do this. He does this instead of following God's plan. Now he tries to redirect the people. A lot of folks have asked, why is it that Aaron's not just struck down here? Well, there's answers to that, but I think it's at least worth saying. He does try to direct the people. He's trying to compromise with them. He says, look, I'm going to make this, and then I'm going to direct you to worship, and you're going to make a feast to the Lord. You're going to be worshiping Yahweh. He's trying to, it's what some call the negative example, what they call syncretism. They have their local gods. They have their local customs. They have these old practices. We want to teach them about Yahweh worship, and so we're going to do this incrementally. We're going to allow them to have their gods, and we're going to try to steer them away slowly. Oftentimes it just doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work here. He's trying to redirect them and offer a feast to the Lord, but the result is a kind of false feast. He can't do it because he's compromising with evil instead of leading with integrity. What they needed there was a high priest who could boldly point them to Yahweh instead of compromising with the worst angels of their nature. And then, in the end, he actually becomes kind of an Adam figure. Because what does he do in response to it? And it said, he was defending himself to Moses. He said, hey, I threw it in the fire. But the last line there is verse 24. They gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. I don't know how it happened. I mean, it just was there, right? But false leadership deflects blame instead of taking responsibility. He's tried to compromise with evil, and now he's trying to blame them for it. It's not that different. Our Bible study this morning, we're reading in Genesis 3 in the fall. And what does Adam say when he's trying to account for his failure as a leader? He said, look, this woman who you gave me this fruit, and I ate it. Blames her, blames God. It's your fault. You gave her to me. What did I do? I just ate the thing. There's no sense of responsibility. There's no sense of owning that. And that's a false kind of leadership, that he deflects blame instead of taking responsibility. His responsibility was to be in front of the people, to lead them away from the misguided things that they were doing, and to give them something better. So what's the answer to all that? You have the failure of the people. You have the people of God have failed. You've got their leader has failed. You have a false leader. Well, the answer is a mediator. And I think where it gets interesting is how they respond to it. So God tells Moses up on the mountain, verse 7, you start seeing God is going to tell him, look, this is what's going on down there. I see it. I see what's happening. And his description of this, after he describes it to Moses in detail, all that's going on in building this calf, he says this, verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. This is not something you want to be described as by God. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. Just leave me alone. I think it's one of two most misunderstood verses in this chapter. But the first thing I want you to see is the answer to all this ultimately is going to be a mediator. The mediator is going to be the cure to the problem that they've set up here in these first few verses. But it begins to recognize that the consequence of sin is the wrath of God. Not a phrase that we really like to talk about much, but that's what you have. Now we see that, what is the thing, is they are a stiff-necked people. They're like this is like the cattle. This is like the ox that just they're trying to steer to plow a field and will not move. That's what they are. Israel is a stiff-necked people. The people of God here are stiff-necked. They're stubborn. They refuse to follow where they're led. They refuse to follow what God has laid out for them. So just leave me alone. The consequence of sin is the wrath of God. A lot of times we see that phrase, just leave me alone, let my wrath burn against them, is that sometimes we think about this as a picture of God as like he's sulking here. Just get away from me. Just let me go and just let me just unleash this wrath upon them. What he's doing, though, is I think something much more subtle and much more significant. He is stating the consequence of their sin. For them to just leave me alone is what they've asked to do by breaking covenant with him. That is what sin does. Sin says, you've got your way, God, but I've got mine, and I'm smarter than you, and I'm wiser than you, and I've perceived the world better than you, so I'm going to go my own way. So for God to say, well, just leave me alone, that's what they're asking for. They may not know that's what they're asking for, but that's what they've asserted, because they're asserting their independence from God. So to say, leave me alone, and let my wrath burn against them, is to simply state the consequence of their sin, because the wages of sin is death. And to say, I want to go my own way, I want to do this without you, I don't want to follow your ways, well, then you get the God of the universe that says, well, then you're separated from me, and I'm your only source of life. Left to their own devices, they would be cut off, leaving only Moses. But that picture, just let me alone, let my wrath burn against them, and I may consume them in order that I may make a great nation of you. So there's an offer here that I'll just throw them aside, Moses, and I'll just rebuild this nation on you and you alone. One offer is to say he could just abandon them. But I think what's really happening here is this is an offer for a mediator. If the covenant is to be sustained, if this relationship with God and Israel is to be sustained, it will be sustained by the mercy of God through a mediator. Both sides of that are really important. This is, in this statement, leave me alone, is an invitation by God not to be left alone. I think that's an important thing to see. This is a pattern that you actually see in Scripture over and over again. God will say, leave me alone. And then the person that he's saying that to, their job is to not leave him alone and advocate for something better. It's the same thing that happened with Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. This is evil people, just leave me alone. No, I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to negotiate. Happens all the time in the prophets. Just abandon me. Just leave me alone, and I'll just let my judgment come upon them. And the prophet's job is to step into that gap. That is an invitation to mediate. The fact that he tells him, just leave me alone so my wrath may burn, is to say that he doesn't want that to happen. He wants something better. But it's in mediation that the mediator will come and set God's justice right alongside God's mercy. And it will be this interplay between God's justice and God's mercy that has to be resolved. Can God give mercy and still be just? Can God give justice and still extend mercy? What does Moses say? As he rises in response, verse 11, Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you've brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they will inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of, bringing on his people. So Moses accepts the invitation to mediate. And really what is he says? He really gives a series of arguments. He says, one, he says, look, you've already delivered them. You delivered from Egypt. Why would you want to deliver them from Egypt only to just wipe them out in the wilderness? You're not going to take them home. You've got to get your job done. Let's get them home. So deliver them. You've already delivered them. Let's continue this. Don't display this to the other nations. That the way that he responds to Israel is Yahweh's display of who he is before the other nations. There is a sense of mission that's tied up in the journey of Israel. How other people view God matters. And Moses says, well, look, don't let the Egyptians just gloat over the destruction of your people after what you've done to them. Do it for the sake of your name. And then finally he talks about their promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that you are the God of covenant. You've made a promise to them. Deliver on your promise in the most emphatic way. So these things, God's sense of mission, God's sense of integrity to his covenant, God's work in delivering a people, are all the reasons why God would relent from this desire just to extend pure justice on these people and just let that wrath, that just righteous wrath, be poured out on them. And so what it happens then is that the mediator then satisfies the justice of God as he brings the mercy of God. And that's where we begin to see that the biblical picture of a mediator is a little different than some of the stories I was telling at the beginning. This is not about some kind of business litigation and somebody sitting around and negotiating some kind of settlement. Something much more profound is happening. Look at the things that Moses does. As God has relented, what does Moses then do? So verse 15, he turns, he goes down the mountain, he has these tablets. Verse 16, it pauses just to note what these tablets are. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. There's that picture of his covenant. I said last week, these two tablets are not because they were so wordy, they took up too much space. It's that the idea is that they're both saying the same thing. It's like copies of a contract that you're handing to both sides. So there's this sense of this agreement. As he goes down the mountain, Joshua meets him there, and I think it's a fascinating interplay. They hear the noise of the people, verse 17, as they shouted. And he said, there's a noise of war in the camp. And he said, it's not the sound of shouting for victory or the sound of the cry of defeat, but it's the sound of singing I hear. So the people are lost in this revelry, having this big celebration. And it says in verse 19, as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot. Now that doesn't sound like a mediator, right? His anger burned hot. Who does that sound like? That sounds like God. His wrath is burning against these people. And he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. The symbolic destruction of this covenant, which is what they've done. They've broken covenant with God, the one that they said they were bound to. And he took the calf they made, and he burned it with fire and ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water and made the people drink it. Now that does not sound like he's just going to kind of wash over this thing. What is he doing there? I mean, how are they burning gold? Well, they got this thing is built on this wood thing, and they're wrapping it in gold plate like you saw in all the instructions of the tabernacle. But he's melting this down, and he's having them drink it. They're drinking the poison of idols, while she's also showing them the impotence of the thing that they've burned up. This is a useless thing you've built that can be burned down and destroyed. And that's the thing you've been worshiping. This is a series of prophetic acts. I think one of the mistakes we make, I think the second most confusing verse in the chapter is that we see Moses shattering the tablets, that he just lost his temper, that this is some rash thing that he's just, he needed to keep control of his emotions. No, this is a work of prophetic leadership. It's not some emotional outburst. He is leading the people by demonstrating as vividly as possible what they have done. They have broken covenant. They're drinking from the poison of idolatry, a poison that will not satisfy and will in fact kill. Then he calls on the priests to gather to him, to make them change. He said, he stood, verse 26, Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." And the sons of Levi gathered around him, and he said, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from the gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. We've just been talking about the creation of the priesthood. The first act of the priesthood, the sons of Levi, is to gather up their swords and to go through and kill 3,000 people. The idea that they're killing those who are the instigators of this idolatry. He's calling on the priest to bring justice to those leaders. Those who violate the covenant will be cut off from the people. This is exactly what's happening for them. They are ordained for the service of the Lord at the cost of the death of the wickedness around them. That's the ordination of the priesthood here. It's a reminder, it's that there's guilt among the people. And Moses is calling the people to purity by cutting off those who are leading. He says, "Today you've been ordained for the service of the Lord, each one at the cost of his son and of his brother, so that he might bestow a blessing upon you this day." And then he says to the people after that, what's the follow-up? Verse 30, "You've sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They've made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." But the Lord said to Moses, "Whoever has sinned against me, I'll blot out of the book. But now go, lead the people to the place about which I've spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. That does not sound like the whole thing is Moses just gets him to call back from his temperament, and he just says, everything's fine. We'll just ignore this. He has the 3,000 are executed. Moses goes up to try to plead for them, to make atonement for their sin. And notice, here's the depth of his mediation. He offers his own life on behalf of his people. He says, "Lord, just blot me out." And all of that is an echo of Jesus in profound ways. God is, he has a mediator who stands in the gap, who offers himself on our behalf. But notice here that God does not accept his offer. He says, "Look, I'm going to blot out the people I've spoken that disobey me. I'm not going to accept you." God doesn't accept, but he also tells them to lead them on to the promised land. There's consequences still ahead. And there's this plague. We're not clear if that plague is now or if that plague comes later. But Moses is working to satisfy the justice of God, even as he pleads with them for the mercy of God. That's Moses as mediator. I think that's a complicated picture. And I'm not going to resolve it all this week because I think he's going to build on it in the next couple weeks. We're going to be looking at it over the next few weeks to see what Moses is doing. But there's a picture of the kind of mediator that we have. We begin to see that picture. I was at a retreat this week, and our main speaker was a New Testament scholar, expert on Paul. And one of the things he said in Paul's writings, one of the patterns that he sees is that Paul's letters were always directed at the moral formation of the people of God. One of the things that Paul wanted to see in churches, what is the church growth that Paul most cared about? The church growth was not a numerical change. It was the moral formation of the people. That the people were growing in their love of God and being able to live for him more and more each and every day. How are we being shaped as the people of God? I think the temptation is to see the problem as too light and the solution as too light. What God is solving is a problem of, some people who occasionally mess up, occasionally get a little out of whack. And if we have that as the problem, then the solution will be not very much. I think Exodus 32 invites us to see the real depth of the problem. What is their problem? Their hearts are at Egypt and not with Yahweh. It's hard to get Egypt out of their bones. And that's our problem too. That's our struggle with sin. It's the depth of the solution is a mediator who will take on the burden of the people, who will do for them what they cannot do for themselves, and will lead them to become who they are called to be. And what Moses is modeling for us in 32 is a picture of who Jesus is for us. He is our perfect mediator who satisfies the justice of God, who then allows us to live in light of the mercy of God, who leads us to a better way of living, a way of living for Him in all that we do through His power that is at work within us. So stop trusting in the idols. See the idols in your own life. See the temptation to depend on your own strength, your own power, or just the idols of Egypt that settle in your own bones. Let's stop trusting in idols and trust our mediator to lead us home. Let's pray. God, I thank you that though we may see the depth of our sin, we are not doomed to live out of that sin, but that we can depend on your great life and mercy given to us in Jesus Christ. I thank you that our mediator is advocating for us, has died for us, is changing us. God, I pray that your Spirit will be upon us, that we may live for you in all that we do. In Jesus' name, amen. If we can help in any way, please come while we stand and sing.